no administration, Republican or Democrat, had even thought was an issue. And so what you find is now inside the government itself is a political party that is a party of fanaticism masquerading as politics and only playing the political game to the extent that they can to actually undermine the power of the very government they serve by making it dysfunctional, and the failure of government, and therefore the uplifting of private enterprise, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when you have people who won't build trains or roads or jobs programs, who will undermine every effort to make the government do what all civilizations do, which is provide a public space, and then turn around at the end of the day and say, you see, this doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work because the people on the inside track at this point in history have an agenda to make sure it does not work because they don't believe in government per se, much less the United States government that they have demonized as doing the work of the devil because of the so-called moral issues. How did what Dad and I did in the 70s and 80s impact the present politics, other than inspiring people like Michelle Bachmann and so forth to get into politics because they saw the films that I made, etc., with my father? The real impact is much different and larger. And I spoke about this the other night, but I'm going to repeat it here, because it gets to the heart of why Jay has to win in this congressional election and why many people like him have to win, because it's such a serious situation. When you consistently demonize the government as doing the work of Satan and evil because you disagree with the so-called moral issues, you create a climate in which Goldman Sachs and the Koch brothers and Wall Street and everyone else that really counts, who would not allow these rubes from the lower white underclass that are the shock troops of Michelle Bachmann and Rick Perry even caddy for them on their golf courses. When you have demonized the government sufficiently with that group of people so they will always vote against their own economic interests, because now to them anything the government does is evil, including just the basic functions of community like having taxes, having trains, having roads, having infrastructure, you succeed in opening the door to a new oligarchy whose only chance of dominating the culture is to make sure that no one is powerful enough to regulate it. And so Goldman Sachs and people like them could care less about the social moral issues we were out banging on the door for. What they care about is that they have a certain segment of the population that now has a knee-jerk anti-American, anti-government reaction to any suggestion that they be taxed or regulated or even watched. And so it's a perfectly symbiotic relationship literally made in hell. Now you have bridge builders between these two camps who are doing it on purpose. People like my old friend Dick Armey, who made sure that, first of all, the Tea Party would include more than 60% of the old evangelical shock troops from the pro-life movement, which, by the way, parenthetically, is why you kept hearing our slogans revived in the healthcare debate of death panels and all the other threats that were leveled at Obama for wanting to provide healthcare for 34 million uninsured Americans, end of parentheses. But on a larger level, there are people like Dick Armey and Grover Norquist and others who have built bridges deliberately, trying to make sure that the fire and the heat and the hatred and the reaction on the social issues keeps working for them to keep their own underclass in line. Because in terms of their actual economic interests, desire to educate children, have a living wage, the very people that they have voting for them in these primaries, economically speaking, should be Democrats. And the only way to keep prying their vote loose for Republican candidates is to get them to vote for BS that has nothing to do with their actual lives and only has to do with religious correctness. And so it's not an accident that the Republicans have not done anything about any of the social issues when in power, until now, by the way, when the new generation of actual fanatics, remember what I said, we used to be agitators and now the agitators are inside the gates, have taken power, and all of a sudden these people who say it's all about jobs and the economy, what are they doing? They're doing statements on reaffirming that it's in God we trust. Like that's a pressing issue when you have 9+ jobless rate. On the local level all over the country, they're instituting things like we just saw down in Mississippi on abortion. They have spent enormous amounts of money in 39 states on citizen initiatives against gay marriage. And so the issues may slightly change. It's gay marriage one year, abortion another, but the playbook is exactly the same. And it is to take social/religious issues, keep your basic voting bloc that decides who your primary people are going to be in the election juiced up and fired up on a bunch of BS. Because I don't mean each of these issues are BS. BS in the sense they have no intention of doing anything about it at Dick Armey or any of these people. Get them to keep voting for your bloc so that the real business of the Republican Party, which is to make sure that the ruling oligarchy is never again challenged in this continent, can proceed. And that is why no one's in jail for the Wall Street meltdown. That is why, out of the Fortune 500, 30 corporations paid no taxes last year. That is why the CEO of Goldman Sachs now earns, and here's a number we can get our head around as opposed to just billions, chew on this for a minute, $250,000 a day. Now what do you think the differential is between his paycheck and his doorman? Well, you know, my son served in the Marine Corps, and it was interesting because I wrote some books on military-civilian relations during that period of time because he got me thinking about it. One of the things I noted was that the pay difference between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a young Marine just graduating boot camp at Paris Island or MCRD in San Diego is 11 times. All right? That's all. That's not that big a step. You're still in the same universe. You just get a bigger TV and an extra couple of bedrooms. But you're all in the same universe. You have the same health care. You have the same access to services, for instance, the schools on base, et cetera, et cetera. You're in the same world. But when you're earning $250,000 a day, you're not living on this planet anymore. Your obligations of citizenship are so far gone, you may as well be an emperor in Persia. And we have a wealth disparity that the 1% and 99% that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of. And why is it seemingly impossible to get someone like a Fox News or a Rupert Murdoch to pay attention to this, and rather than just that, spewing the Republican line endlessly? It is because they can count on a moralistic, judgmental, hate-filled, reactionary religious right to keep towing the line on the moral issues, which have nothing to do with reason and argument, and everything to do with a grimly held faith that group feels is slipping away from them, as often they're losing their own children to better arguments, for instance, when they go to college, learn about evolution if they ever let them go. A lot of these kids are not allowed to go to schools, or quote, secular schools. But the fact of the matter is, the Republican Party has been hijacked by a group of people who have imposed on it a level of religious fanaticism that means that when you come to this congressional district in this fight, why Jay has to win, aside from the actual merits of the candidate he's against, is because if the Republican Party succeeds at this next step, which is, remember what I was talking about, the agitator becomes the candidate, not literally, but in terms of spirit. If that group, if those 87 congressmen, as it were, or a Michelle Bachmann or a Rick Perry, or people who are pretending they're like that, so they can get the votes, actually goes to the next step, which is to begin to implement a theocratic program, which is literally to do what they do to gay people when they try to roll back gay marriage, district by district, always going to the same playbook, as applied to all other issues, women's choice, what's taught in schools, science, which is not a popular subject with the evangelical right, re-educate our young people to no longer believe in global warming, which means literally we will destroy this planet and are destroying it, etc. These are not Jack Kemp and John F. Kennedy disagreeing over policy, or Goldwater, or even Nixon, who might have been a crook, but he wasn't insane. It's a different kind of thing. Crooks you can deal with, you know what they want. But we're dealing with a division within the country that has, on one side, a commitment to fact, and on the other side, a commitment to fantasy, to the death. And the other side is not going to give an inch. And when they pretend to be normal and talk like you and me, as Michelle Bachmann did when she looks into the camera and says, oh, submission to me means that I respect my husband and he respects me, when her church group that she's been in for 22 years literally believes that women must be subservient to their husbands in order to be Christians in good standing, and has taught it and has embraced it, and she's lived it and believes it, and I know it. And when she was quoted in the New Yorker saying she got into politics because of our projects, I know her professor who taught her at Oral Roberts University Law School before it was taken over and moved by Pat Robertson, and I know every player in that particular game. And I can tell you with absolute assurance that she sat down with her people before these debates saying, how do we deal with this question? And they came up with the answer, and it was absolutely no different than the Iranians today looking us in the eyes saying, we have a nuclear program, and of course it's just for peaceful purposes. And you know that they know that you know they're lying, but that's the game. And so when you have the candidates of the right in America acting normal, acting is the word because that's not their agenda. Their agenda is a country with minimal infrastructure, no social safety net, where you have a ruling oligarchy running the country and everybody else is on a minimum wage. In other words, just a step from where we are today. I have an invitation that is in the works to speak to the executive committee of the National Auto Workers Union. And the topic of my talk there, if I give it, and if not there, somewhere else, will be, why do people who claim to love Jesus hate the working man? Well, simple. Because their symbiotic relationship between corporate America and the religious right is now bled into something that I'll illustrate for you by telling a different story, and then I'll bring you back to this point. James Dobson, who started Focus on the Family about 6 years ago, tried to get a friend of mine, Richard Cizik, fired from being the vice president of the National Association of Evangelicals. What had Cizik done? Had he stolen money? Was he molesting young boys? Was he no longer an evangelical Christian? Did he no longer believe the Bible? No. He gave a talk saying he thought global warming was real. And James Dobson wrote a letter to the board of the NAE saying, we cannot have someone who claims to be a Christian fighting against our president's policies, being George W. Bush. That's where it's at. So this illustrates the point of how people who say they love Jesus can be against the working man. They're against the working man now because, in the same way that politicians return favors to donors and why money corrupts our system sometimes, the right is not only on the inside of the politics now when it comes to the religious right, they are actually now mirroring back the corporatist bullshit and anti-fact truths on other issues that have nothing to do with the traditional agenda. So it's not about just abortion and gay rights anymore. It's like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Now they're really in bed with corporate America. And there are scads of people, like Gary North, for instance, who's a Reconstructionist leader in what's called the Dominionist movement. I don't have to explain what that means to you. Dominion. I talk all about it in Sex, Mom, and God. Who's written literally tomes proving that the Bible is pro-capitalist, private enterprise policy, and they go to the scriptures, the Old Testament and the New Testament, sort it through, and come away with basically an endorsement of Ayn Rand, literally. Now, how you get from Jesus to Ayn Rand, I don't quite understand, but they've managed to do it. And so now, the corporations make use of the religious right to make sure they're never regulated. Why? Because the religious right has succeeded in demonizing the opponent, not as someone you disagree on policy with, but as they do with Barack Obama. He's literally the Antichrist if he's not a Muslim who wasn't born here. But that demonization of the opposition isn't just because he's the first black man in the White House, which, by the way, has 99% to do with the vitriol that's been thrown at him and why they've stonewalled him to the degree they have. But that aside, it's the culmination of a long process that sees in Supreme Court decisions, in decisions made by Congress and various presidents, an undermining of what they call biblical absolutes, or to make myself very clear, let's call it the Quran, in terms of, say, whether women can drive in Saudi Arabia or not. And they are reacting, and the way they have fought their battle is not just to look at the individual issues and say, we disagree with you on this. They have now demonized the opponents, in which it's not only the Democratic Party are evil, but the whole system of American government, aside from the military-industrial complex, and the only reason it's not evil, by the way, has nothing to do with patriotism. Speaking as the father of a Marine, they could care less about patriotism. It has to do with the fact that the military-industrial complex is a major leg of the corporate chair they're all sitting on. There's money in them darn hills. And so that is why there's support for the military, because the military has become virtually an all-mercenary force that pays very well. And I'm not talking about the enlisted troops. I'm talking about the fact that in Iraq and